presented very briefly, and as I said, very sketchily, several modes of approaching myth and trying to interpret it. Largely, I think those can be grouped under what I mentioned was the first means of understanding myth, that is, locating it in some way in an external world, whether in the natural world, as for the Cambridge anthropologists, or in social practice, as for Malinowski, and to some extent, Dumézil. What I want to move on to today is, or in this lecture, is an understanding of myth which grounds it instead in the psyche, and believing that myth is a kind of external manifestation of internal psychic processes and structures and so forth. And finally, in this talk, with great trepidation, I will attempt to move on to Levi-Strauss and the structuralists and their attempt to understand myth as what I see as more of a language. We can hardly doubt, I think, the cultural hegemony of Freud for all kinds of interpretive projects, and therefore it will come as no surprise that this is true in the field of myth as well. Freud has a very attractive, seductive formulation, which is the following. Myth is the dreams of the race. Dreams are the myths of the individual. Now, as I say, I submit that this is very attractive. You know, it has that certain linkage, that kind of everything clicks sort of feeling. Myth as the dreams of the race, dreams as the myth of the individual. What I think is problematic here is, what is the mechanism for this kind of exchange? What are the grounds on which one makes this assertion? Finally, just what does it mean? All right. Is there some combined psyche which shares a dream content? What are we really talking about here? The latter view is one which it seems to me will be elaborated by Jung, and I'll come to that in a moment. But let's look at least at what Freud has to say about dreams. And it's from this fundamental work, it seems to me, that he extrapolates to the world of myth, that he's primarily interested in, of course, as is the title of his probably best-known work, the interpretation of dreams. And so I want to begin with a bit of exposition about the interpretation of dream in Freud's system. And as I say, I think it's simply this which he worked out in the treating of individual psyches, which he then projects into a larger cultural screen to say, aha, the same would be true of mythology, if it is the case that myths are in some elusive sense the dreams of the race. As you may well be aware, Freud's psychological theorizing is very strongly influenced by the physical sciences, and he in fact has very physical models of what the psyche is like. And so I usually have a blackboard. This is a little difficult to do without a blackboard, but the fundamental model of the dream for Freud is a kind of large repository at the bottom of something called the latent content. And that latent content then kind of pyramids up to what is the manifest content of the dream. A very physical model here, that there's a kind of a sea of stuff in the psyche, and some of it manages to rise to the surface, as it were. The former is the latent content, more vast and murky, and the latter is the manifest content, which is in fact the dream itself. Now, again, the physical notion is carried through here in the sense that there's a physical process for Freud, or it's very close to a physical process, via which this happens. And that's what he calls the dream work. The dream work is kind of the vector that moves from that murky sea of latent content to the dream itself, its manifest content. The dream work transforms latent into manifest content by 4 means, according to Freud. The first of these is what he called symbolization, or representation. Actually, in a very Deutsch way, he called it considerations of representability. Okay? Now, what are considerations of representability? Well, Freud believes that in order for the latent stuff of our psyches to appear to us in the form of a dream, they must somehow be symbolized, be made into an image, a picture, something that can be represented. Okay? This is kind of like a process of language, I think, but it's a strange language. There will often be, it will be weird the way in which the amorphous sort of content of the unconscious becomes translated into a picture, an image. Now, I'll give you a couple of examples, or at least one clear example from Freud's own work, where there was a dream in which the patient dreamed about a broken leg, in German Beinbruch, and Freud determined in the course of analysis that what that broken leg, which could be easily represented in the dream, was actually talking about, was actually representing in the latent content, was adultery, which in German is literally the breaking of marriage, Ehebruch. All right, so that and this kind of punning, of course, will be central to Freud. But Ehebruch is kind of amorphous and unclear. It's difficult to think of a single image which will represent adultery. However, the broken leg is a very clear pictorial image. And so this is what Freud means by symbolization. Now, this aspect is perhaps one of the most familiar to us in sort of what one thinks of as cocktail party Freudianism, right? That there are these symbols everywhere. I mean, we all share this now. I mean, we're all Freudians in that sense, right? I don't need to tell you what the Washington Monument is, for example, okay? And this, I think, has been popularized and watered down, but to a large extent. A second means via which the dream work operates is condensation. By condensation, Freud means to emphasize that the manifest dream, as I've mentioned, has a much smaller content than the latent content and is a kind of abbreviated translation of it. Thus, composite figures and structures may be created by the psyche so that as little as possible is left out. Now, this is very similar to the symbolization process, but here he's more specifically concerned not exactly with representability, with the attaining of a picture, a pictorial image, but with the way in which a lot of ideas become folded in together and represented as one thing. That's the condensation. Again, I'll give you a Freudian example of this. A patient dreamt about kissing in a car. And Freud determined, again through analysis, that what had really happened here was an odd punning kind of verbal conflation, and what was the genuine concern was autoeroticism. Okay? So, you may wonder about that. Okay. And again, Freud really believes that there is some deep truth that can be discerned in punning and jokes and, as you know, slips of the tongue and so forth. That this is the way the psyche works, to represent to us those things which we may not at some level want to represent even. And that takes me on to the third mode of the dream work, which is displacement. The way that displacement functions for Freud is that especially those contents of the unconscious which are dangerous or threatening to the dreamer, or which the dreamer may not want to recognize, the dreamer or the myth teller may not want to recognize, can be displaced and switched, substituted into some other field, or even sometimes reversed completely. It's a powerful form, essentially, of dream censorship, right? Often, this form of displacement often will, in fact, use opposites. So, for example, an example I think Freud was particularly fond of, actually, in the dream, a patient's hatred of the father might well be represented as excessive concern for the father. Since the hatred the dreamer wants to disguise from herself it becomes displaced into some other representable thing, right? Something of which the patient need not be afraid. And the fourth and final mechanism of the dream work is what Freud calls secondary revision or elaboration. What is meant here is that in the telling of the dream, or in the telling of the dream to the analyst, or even in the recalling of the dream the next morning, say to the self, the conscious mind will impose order on what was inherently messy and disorderly. Particularly, the conscious mind will try to reconcile apparently anomalous material. Now, this is particularly interesting, I think, in that the concept here is clear enough. Freud is saying that, well, after all, when we're not in the dream state, when we're in a waking state, and we even want to recall to ourselves what a dream was about, we'll sort of straighten it out so that it makes sense, right? That's sensible in itself. Now, of course, what Freud is saying is that this kind of secondary revision is, again, a form of censorship, that it's taking what didn't fit and editing that out, whereas what didn't fit may well be what's most significant. So I think it's important to note here, though, what's happening in Freud's relationship to the dream and indeed to the patient. What this means, in a sense, is that when you come in and recount to me, Sigmund, your dream, I will be attempting to discover something that you didn't say. Right? I mean, I'm looking, in a sense, for what isn't there, because that will be, perhaps, the locus of the real issue. Right? Now, the reason I think this is especially significant is I think we see operating here again something similar to what I suggested one could see in Malinowski, namely that this understanding of dream work, I'm dealing here particularly with secondary revision, but I think it extends over many of the other mechanisms as well. This understanding of the dream work clearly gives the power of interpretation to the analyst, right? There is some sense then in which the analyst knows better than the dreamer what the dream is about. And you'll very often see in a fascinating way, if you read Freudian case histories, that Freud constructs the dream and presents it back to the dreamer, who then sometimes says, no, it wasn't that at all, in which case we know he's resisting. And sometimes, and Freud ultimately even recognizes this, that there is a process of construction, and the analyst constructs a dream, presents it to the dreamer, and the dreamer may reject or accept it. Generally, however, Freud finally kind of works upon the dreamer until he or she accepts that version. The Wolfman dream is a fantastic example of this. It's a wonderful narrative. Poor Wolfman dreamt a dream about seeing some white wolves in a tree outside his window. And from this, in a truly incredible tour de force, Freud reconstructs the notion that at a particular time in the infancy of the Wolfman, and he sets it within a month or so, I mean, he can determine precisely when it is, the Wolfman woke up. He was in a crib by his parents' bed. He woke up and was terrified by seeing his parents in the act of copulation. There is nothing in the dream to suggest this. Zero, zilch, nothing. And it's a fantastic detective story whereby Freud ultimately comes to this notion. The white wolves that the Wolfman had seen in his dream are actually the nightgown of his mother billowing about her. And Freud even goes on to describe the position in which the parents were engaging in this act. Now, the Wolfman case is one of the best cases, I think. But always, it seems to me, there's this inherent allocation of power where the person to whom the dream is presented is seen as having the interpretive power and knowledge rather than the person to whom the dream belongs. And again, it seems to me important to point out that far and away the majority of Freud's patients, as I'm sure you know, were women. And to my knowledge, there's only one woman who, in fact, basically took Stanley Fish's position and left. The famous case of Dora, who breaks off the analysis, claiming that's entirely wrong, and rejected it. But I just wanted to suggest that I think in this psychoanalytical mode as in some of the earlier anthropological modes, we may see a kind of imposition on the part of the interpreter on the interpretandum, what is to be interpreted. All right, now I've tried to briefly sketch how dream work operates for Freud, and I've emphasized the processes by which the manifest consciousness transforms the latent unconsciousness. I think then we need to look at what are the contents of the Freudian unconscious. What would be the stuff down there in that murky sea of unconscious, which is via these four mechanisms attempting to come to the surface. I borrow a formulation here actually from the Russian psychologist Voloshinov, who puts it very succinctly in the following way. The world of the unconscious takes in everything that the organism might have done had it been given over completely to the pleasure principle and not been bound by the reality principle and culture. Right? So fundamentally for Freud, the unconscious is going to be this repository of infantile impulses, many of them, or most of them, in his view, sexual in character. What we would do if we were in no way repressed, what would be the complete and pure drive toward gratification and pleasure without cultural parental overlays. As you are probably aware, in the infant, if what's residing down there are these infant impulses, in the infant, according to Freud, the libido is diffused throughout the entire body. It has not yet been localized to particular erogenous zones. And in a famous phrase, Freud characterizes the infant as being polymorphously perverse. So when we look at dreams, and perhaps on this view when we look at myths, that's what we'll be attempting to discern behind them. Again, I think one has to ask about the sort of program operating behind this mode of interpretation. More specifically, in that content of the unconscious, of course, there will be a very large part played in Freud's theory by the Oedipal complex and everything associated with it. And in his view, this will often comprise the main content of the unconscious. I cannot go into here, there's neither time nor are my own views sufficiently worked out about it to go into a lengthy discussion of the Oedipal complex here, which is also at the moment, I think, coming up for serious reevaluation. So let's just go with the really rough and dirty notion that it's simply, the Oedipal complex simply is about the infant's sexual attraction to the mother and the concomitant desire to do away with and replace the father. Now, right away, you'll see where a problem lies there, right? This is a theory created by a man for men, oddly enough, even though Freud's hysterical patients, as I said, were women. But I think one of the things that's certainly been recognized in recent psychoanalytic thought is that this whole construction of the Oedipal complex has to be re-examined in light of the full personhood of women. Now, some of you may be aware of the notion that there's a corresponding thing called the Electra complex. That is not Freudian. That was constructed by other psychoanalysts, and I think it's insufficient. I mean, it's simply mapping the Oedipal complex onto another psyche in a way that I don't think is very satisfying or effective. Freud's own attempt to move from this understanding of the individual psyche, namely that it had these Oedipal impulses and that one can discern them by the interpretation of dreams, sort of moving the machine backwards in the way that I've described those mechanisms working. His attempt to move from that understanding of a private psychology, individual psychology, to a communal notion and understanding of society is, of course, embodied most in his book Totem and Taboo. The interpretation of dreams came out in 1900. Totem and Taboo comes out in 1913. It's a later work, and it's his attempt to move from clinical to cultural analysis, which I believe is largely unsuccessful. Right? And this takes me back to that notion of, sure, it sounds good to say there's this fluid relationship sort of between the dreams and the myth, but I think that very few people are really satisfied with this later notion of Freud's. Basically, Freud attempted in this work to reconstruct a long-buried, but what he believed to be an historical event. You can see how this would be analogous to the analysis of an individual. According to his notion, there was originally a primal horde of brothers under the domination of a fierce and jealous father figure. Eventually, the father significantly is keeping all the women to himself. The brothers, significantly, therefore, are not happy. Right? Eventually, the sons band together and they kill the father and prepare a sacrificial meal of, I leave this to your imagination. On this view, then, all of human society is in fact constructed on complicity in an original and great crime. This, Freud goes on to explain, is the origin of guilt in human individuals. Having murdered and served up the father, the sons, the brothers, then elevate the father to the status of a god as a means of allaying the guilt, one imagines. And they also believe, of course, that this god must be placated. This, in Freud's view, is the origin of religion. As you know, there was no love lost between Freud and religion. All right, he saw it as a terrible delusion and evil, actually. Now, here too, I think it's almost superfluous to point out that this sort of theorizing has to be ripe for a feminist critique. I mean, again, we're invited to believe not only that the contents of the individual psyche are all about wanting to sleep with mom, which I don't think I had, I don't know, but that in fact the basis of human society is what here? A desire to obtain the women for sexual pleasure. And so I think it's easy to see why this has proven, particularly recently, a not very satisfactory archaeology of human society. Further, I think it's been shown increasingly in recent years by the work of Peter Gay in his biography and by a number of other studies, including a very interesting study of the Dora case, which I earlier mentioned. It's been shown in recent years the extent to which Freud's theorizing really recapitulates his own personal life history. And certainly this notion of the father who has the woman and so forth, it's not insignificant that Freud had a stepmother who was very much closer to his own age than to his father's. And this influences, I think Rudnitsky also has shown this along with Gay, that clearly this seems to have an influence on Freud's theorizing. Now, let me step out of character a moment here, and I mentioned that I have a very ambivalent relationship to Freud. You notice how I'm hoist on my own petard here. I mean, what I'm claiming is that, well, everything in Freud's theorizing really goes back to his childhood, which is to be a Freudian, right? It's this kind of horribly closed circle that you can't get out of. And when you read Freud's own works, it's even more tempting. I mean, you find yourself psychoanalyzing Freud with his own damn tools, you know, at the same time wanting to reject his system. So I just display that. You know, what can I do about it? Nevertheless, despite, I think, these very serious and yet tricky problems in Freudian theorizing, there's no question, I think, that psychoanalysis, Freudian psychoanalysis itself, provides a kind of modern mythology, as it were. And I think it would be easy to see this in a way if we move back to that original definition of myth, which I presented from Alan Dundas. Let me refresh your memory on that. A sacred, perhaps we need to excise sacred, a narrative explaining how the world and man came to be in their present form. Now, I submit that whereas in Greek mythology, particularly say in Greek tragedy, we discover that in fact all of our actions are predicated upon the actions of the gods, who underlie our ostensibly autonomous desires and so forth. I think here of the house of Oedipus and the notion that there would be curses upon individual houses which will be worked out in time and over generations. I submit that the Freudian myth, if we subscribe to it, in fact simply substitutes the conditions of childhood and the relations to the parents for those gods and goddesses of Athenian mythology or Greek mythology. We're in very much the same position that if mom had only breastfed me longer, this wouldn't have happened. So I think it's important to recognize that Freud's power, for one thing, and the extent to which we are under the sway of that power in creating a contemporary mythology. Let me move on from Freud to his currently more popular, I think, renegade disciple, Carl Jung. Jung was a follower of Freud's, a student of Freud's. Indeed, Freud was grooming him for the succession, as it were. You'll notice also this is true of all of Freud's children, surrogate children, even his own child, Anna. He has terrible relations with his children, right? This ought to tell us something. Jung is among those, there were others, Otto Rank and so forth, who were students of Freud but eventually broke with the master. In 1909, Jung was traveling to America with Freud, and he experienced a dream. In his dream, there was a house, and this house had several stories. I don't mean that in the sense of narrative, had several levels. The upper story was Rococo. The ground floor was medieval. The cellar was a Roman sort of cellar space. And below that even, there was some sort of primitive cave. Now, of course, he told his dream to Freud, and Freud based his interpretation on, this is so perfect too, on the cave as representing a kind of death wish. A kind of return to the womb and so forth. So what do we see Freud doing in the interpretation of Jung's dream but going down the levels, right, and going back to the beginning and so forth, the way in which he performs an analysis. However, Jung saw that that was not really the meaning of his dream, but he saw rather in the dream an image of the psyche and its successive layers, which he read as successively deeper levels of the unconscious. This lowest level, for example, the cave, barely structured in any way, barely discernible in a sense, Jung understood as the level of primitive man, barely accessible to consciousness, but still there as a foundation for the rest of the entire structure, read of the house or of consciousness. Over the next 10 to 20 years, Jung elaborated this idea of a collective unconscious, shared by all persons, barely accessible to their conscious minds. He based this construct, I think it's fair to say, this hypothesis, on the appearance, partially cross-culturally, also simply trans-individual, that is, in his practice, in his psychoanalytical practice. He saw in the dreams of his patients, as he thought he saw in the myths of various cultures, again, a sort of fluid boundary between those two in his work. He saw the appearance of mythical archetypes, he called them, which could not have been independently known. That is, the reappearance continually of these archetypical figures convinced Jung that there must be some sort of basic stuff that everyone was tapping into, all right? Some sort of unconscious material there that was shared across cultures and across individuals. In this view, myths originate in the human brain, which functions uniformly across time and space with only minor variations. Now, these archetypes or images are very difficult to get hold of in Jungian theory. That is, his views of them, his very definitions of what this is, what is an archetype, seems in fact very shifting from time to time. And sometimes archetype will seem to mean a figure who appears in a myth or narrative. And I'll go on to these in a moment. At other times, however, archetype seems to be not quite a particular figure set in motion, but a sort of a predilection to think in certain patterns. So I just want to stress that while this seems to be a very easily graspable concept, in fact, it's a little fuzzy in Jung's thinking what he really means when he says that we share these archetypes. He sometimes speaks of them as some set of pre-existent inherited forms which give definite shape to the materials of the collective unconscious. A particular physical image that he used is that the archetype is like a mold into which the unconscious may pour itself. And I've thought of a modern update of that, of the archetypes being like a kind of mythical database, right, that you can go into and draw upon. It seems that at times that's the notion he wants. Jung felt that there were three psychic levels then. There was a consciousness, clearly. There is a personal unconscious that each individual has, and then underlying that, in the basement of the house, if you will, there is this collective unconscious. In Jung's psychoanalytic practice, he believes that the major factor of psychic life is a quest for wholeness or unity among these components of the psychic life. All right, that one must come to terms with uniting in some way the consciousness and the personal unconscious, but also incorporating into oneself and becoming aware of the shared unconscious, the collective unconscious. And so Jungian therapy tends to be an attempt to integrate what he saw as these portions of the self. I should say, this is going to screw up a neat theory in a way. I should say that actually for Jung, however, despite the fact that he sees these three levels of consciousness, this is a sort of an anomaly, normally his perfect number is 4. He's a big guy for quaternities as opposed to trilogies. All right? So, for example, Jungian therapy often bases itself on the revelation of what he calls the mandala, a circle, which he sees as being divided into 4 quadrants. He believes, for example, that the Trinity of the Judeo-Christian system is not really just a Trinity, but one must add in Mary as the 4th to make a whole figure, and so forth. So, lest you be left with a totally tripartite ideology, we should messy up the picture. Now, let me say a word more about, it's impossible to say a word more about the collective unconscious. It's a very spacey idea. You know, what is it? Where is it? Is it somehow floating along beneath us all? It's very elusive, I think. Attractive, again, in a certain way, but elusive. Let me say a little bit more about the archetypes, the particular archetypes that Jung elaborates. Especially 2, which seem to me particularly intriguing and useful in some ways. The first of these is what Jung calls, I think this was before the good old radio play, the shadow. Who knows what lurks in that? There must be a relationship there. The shadow, very important archetype for Jung. This is the dark side of the personality, not surprisingly. But more specifically, it is an alter ego repressed by the conscious mind. And, I think even more intriguingly, often projected onto others. The shadow personifies everything that the subject refuses to acknowledge about himself. In one famous formulation, Jung claimed that Hitler was the shadow of the German people. On a more mundane level, Jungian therapy would claim that, for example, and this is very an interestingly satisfying idea, I think. Well, I think we all know people in our lives who will be continually complaining about the pettiness of their coworkers, right? So petty is she that da, da, da. This would be an example, Jung would feel, of projecting the qualities which are actually qualities of the self onto the other. All right? The shadow is not within me. It's not my problem. It's his problem. Right? He's this kind of individual. Why can't he be more generous? I gave him my good stuff. Why doesn't he give me back something? You see how there's a very intricate relationship there, that what one is actually complaining about is one's own parsimony, but projecting it onto the other. So the shadow, I think, can be a very useful concept in the interpretation of psyche, certainly, and I think sometimes of myths. The second important concept, a second important archetype and powerful one in Jung's system is what he calls the anima and the animus. Anima being, of course, the feminine ending, animus, the masculine ending, for the Latin noun meaning simply the spirit or the soul. These now how to begin? In Jung's system, each of us has a masculine and a feminine side. However, the notion of the anima or the animus will be that set of qualities within the individual which it is culturally inappropriate to identify in the self. Therefore, the masculine side of a female psyche, the feminine side of a male psyche. Right? In Jung's thought, we each have both of these, but at least in our particular cultural setup, we cannot acknowledge a man has until perhaps the late 20th century, it's difficult for a man to acknowledge a feminine side, it's difficult or uncomfortable for a woman to acknowledge a masculine side. Consequently, as with the shadow, Jung believes that this anima or animus image is often projected onto another. In his view, quote, falling in love is the mutual anima, animus projection between two individuals. You needed to know this, right? This is useful. And similarly, in a pessimistic way, such a relationship, this relationship of projection, which is erotic love in Jung's view, is of course bound to end in failure, if not disaster, since the other can never fulfill the role of being one's own soul. All right? Consequently, what is more desirable, indeed what is absolutely necessary, is rather that one unify the portions of one's own soul, not project them onto another and thereby attempt to appropriate or control them. Right? So that his whole project, the project of Jungian analysis and maturity, is one about integrating the various parts of the soul rather than projecting them onto others. Now, there are a number of other archetypes whom Jung discusses from time to time, and I'll just mention them. He sees archetypical figures, and by this I mean in this use of the term, I think he means simply figures whom he sees recurring again and again, either in personal narratives or in cultural narratives. And among these he numbers the mother, the maiden, the child, often some sort of a child hero. There was a particular study, Jungian study, of the child hero completed by the historian of religion, Karl Karenyi. But the child hero, for example, in our own culture might be represented again by the baby Jesus. Someone who, even at the age of 6, is able to confer with the elders in the temple, or so forth. Is that wrong? Is it 12? I'm sorry. Young kid. Right? And a final archetypal figure in Jung's system is what he calls the old man. And he, in fact, himself experienced this figure in his dreams. He would apparently have recurrent dreams in which a character, a kind of a guru, whom he called Philemon, which is a classical name, would come to him and speak with him about sort of the development of his life and what he should do and so forth. So he was particularly intimate with the old man. Now, in Jung's system, as I said, there is a need for integration of the parts of the psyche, but he also sees the move toward maturity and full adulthood as being a process of what he calls individuation. But by this, he means a process in which the person becomes a psychological individual who is indeed indivisible, a unity whole. Right? This would entail a harmonizing of the conscious and the unconscious via a continuing dialogue between the portions of the psyche and all psychic levels. This he often speaks of, this process of individuation, which is itself a process of wholeness, becoming whole. Jung often speaks of as a spiritual journey or quest, whereby the individual shifts from domination of the ego and the will to a recognition of guidance by some more unconscious figure, right? By some kind of integrating factor and something less under the conscious control of the will. In this journey of spiritual wholeness, the individual who is undergoing this process, as I say, lets go of the will to some extent, realizes that there's some guiding factor in his life, not of his own making, and Jung calls this the self, but he also says in one point, it is indistinguishable from a God. So that there is a very interesting way in which to journey into the self and to integrate the self for Jung is, in fact, to integrate for oneself a God, or to find the God within oneself. In his view, a culture needs myth for this purpose. And he says that the labor of analysis, this type of analysis, which would lead one to this individuation and maturity, is essential if we are to have a chance at freedom and at writing our own scripts in life. Now, Campbell follows, obviously, in the footsteps of Jung, and I think those of you who are familiar with him will recognize that. His most famous work, best known, and I think best work, is called The Hero with 1,000 Faces. And I would group with this his other work. Of course, he has many, as you know. He's very prolific. The Masks of God. The Hero we will look at more specifically in a few lectures. But in both of these works, Campbell is attempting to find one underlying myth of which he sees multiple manifestations across cultures. He calls this, in his Hero study, the monomyth, right? And a similar view is operating in his exploration of gods across cultures. This is in some ways very attractive, and as I said, I will look at it in detail in the consideration of the so-called heroic career. There are a couple of criticisms, however, which I think one has to level at Campbell, and one of them is the following, that he will very frequently make universal claims for a phenomenon of which he has really a handful, sometimes two examples, right? It's not uncommon for him to say, one good example is the myth of Jonah. He says, well, in the Judeo-Christian Bible, we see the myth of someone being swallowed in a whale and being regurgitated and so forth and so on. He has one other example of that myth in the Eskimo culture, from which he claims that it's a universal myth that we see across cultures and times and so forth. This is a very typical Campbell process, and that has led to his being discounted by serious scholars in the field. The fact that he's too ready to generalize in this extremely universalizing way. I have a second critique of Campbell, which troubles me to some extent, and I'll digress here a moment. Some of you may be familiar with the famous parody of Hemingway. And you have to get in your mind, you know, Hemingway, it tasted good, you know, whatever. All right, there's a famous parody of Hemingway, which features an accountant commuting in from New Haven on his daily trek to the city. And in the parody, of course, he's sitting there thinking to himself, I commute good. Right? Now, I suggest that something very similar is what Campbell presents to individuals. Namely, clearly the Hemingway's characters are persons who are warriors and heroes and striving toward great things, right? The commuter, the accountant probably isn't, right? So he's deluding himself when he casts himself as the heroic Hemingway figure. I think there are ways in which Campbell holds out a kind of delusion to us when he claims that to take our daily ride on the 823 may be to become Theseus, to become Heracles.